Dune Part 3 is scheduled to release on the 18th of December, which happens to be one of my best friend's birthdays, and one day before my own birthday. Speaking of birthdays, last month I went to Paris to celebrate my friend Liz's birthday, and while I was there, she got me absolutely hooked on the Dune movies. And when I left, she very kindly gave me her own copy of Dune, the famous science fiction work. Truly, she is the Bene Gesserit. Inviting me to celebrate her birthday was nothing but a plan within a plan to get me hooked onto Dune like a Fremen on a sandworm. My friend Liz also happens to stream on Twitch. I'll go ahead and throw a link to her channel in the description if you want to check her content out. She's a great entertainer and an even greater friend. Liz, thank you so much for lending me your copy. So the initial question was, can I read Dune before Dune Part 3 releases? The obvious answer is yes, and that's what I've done. It took me about a month to read it, but that is including days where I didn't pick up the book. You could probably knock this out in like a week, maybe two. So accepting that I've read Dune before Part 3 hit cinemas, the next question was, can I read Dune Messiah before watching its film adaptation? And if we look at the size difference between the first Dune book and Messiah, then yes, this is a ridiculous size difference. I think this is like 800 pages, this is like 250, 300. If we got through this in a month, we are absolutely getting through Messiah before December 18th. So now the more interesting and exciting question is, can I read all 6 of the core Dune books by Frank Herbert before Part 3 releases? Well, let's try. I finished reading Dune about 8 or 9 days ago. I finished it on the 13th of August, and I'm currently already a third of the way through Dune Messiah. So the rest of this video is going to be me diving into my thoughts on the book itself. We'll try and save film talk for the end. Once I finish Dune Messiah, we'll make another video diving into that book, and ideally, as I move through these books, we should have the series finished before Dune Part 3, with each book having its own video diving into my thoughts on each one. If I fail to get through all 6 before Part 3 releases, that'd be a shame, but if I fail it, so be it. It should still be fun to talk about these books in the meantime. I really want to treat these videos as less of a critical book review and more of like a casual discussion. So it's going to be a bit of a mix. I have some notes here on my computer, some things are just going to be thoughts that I'm going to rattle straight off the dome. But anyway, know that there'll be spoilers ahead. We're going to talk about this book. Please enjoy. So to address the physical book itself, Liz gave me this printing, which was published by Ace Books, and while it has the dreaded soon-to-be a motion picture tag that every book owner despises, the artwork on the cover is otherwise gorgeous. I really, really like the artwork that's wrapped around this book. This edition from Ace is 884 pages, which does include a map of Arrakis and some appendices at the end of the book. And this one does also contain an afterword by Brian Herbert, Frank Herbert's son. With this being pre-owned, I love how worn this is. The kind of retro style art, the worn edges, and just the size of it makes it feel like a little ancient tome. Now, since I bought the complete 6 Dune books as a package deal online, I also ended up getting this version. I'm sure this is the version folks are used to seeing more commonly in stores now. This one also has a circular tag, but this one is older, so it says soon to be a major motion picture, whereas this one says now a major motion picture. I prefer the artwork on the Ace publishing. However, the artwork on the Hodescape printing is also really nice, and I really appreciate how along the spine of all the Hodescape books, they have the artwork along the spine. Little portraits of the cover art exists on the spine. Between these two versions, this one, the Hodescape version, is 577 pages in length. It shaves off 307 pages and ends up creating a bit of a smaller profile by 2 means. Firstly, it has wider pages. You can probably see the overhang there. And because it has those wider pages, it means more text and fill up a single page. But also, while both of these versions both have 4 appendices and they both have the world map of Arrakis, interestingly, the Hodescape version doesn't have the afterword by Brian Herbert that this one does. Now, I know that Brian's own writing career isn't celebrated like his father's. I know that a lot of diehard fans don't particularly enjoy Brian's contributions to his father's universe. However, I personally found it interesting to read this man's thoughts on his father and his father's work, and I do feel like the Hot Escape version suffers a little for lacking those insights into the author. However, having said that, I can recognize that losing the afterword doesn't take away from the actual story, and at the end of the day, if you've bought this book, you've bought it for the story, so nothing is taken away there. I will say as well, in regards to the map of Arrakis, you have like this 2-page spread of the planet, and I'll show you here that in the Ace book, it's a little bit, due to the verticality of the pages, it's a little condensed, a little squished kinda, whereas here in the Hot Escape, I keep saying Hot Escape, the Hot Escape version, because of the wider pages, the map seems, well, wider and less condensed. This is a lot nicer to look at. Whilst the actual content of the books and the stories are the same, I do think there's a kind of psychological effect at play when recommending these books to people. It's the difference between telling someone, hey, you should read this book, it's a little under 900 pages, versus, hey, check out this book, it's a little under 600 pages. It's my understanding from teachers that I know personally in the UK that children and young adults aren't reading as much, and I know that the National Literacy Trust reported that in 2025, the percentage of children and young people who told us they enjoyed reading was its lowest in 20 years. So if you know a young reader, and you want to encourage them to read more, and you want to introduce them to the world of Dune, it might seem less intimidating knowing that reading isn't as strong as it used to be to introduce them to a 600-page book than one that's near 1,000 pages. I have not read this from cover to cover because it is just the same story, but from flicking through the pages, the wider page spread, the formatting of the text across that wider page does look a lot easier on the eyes. And also a very small detail is that the Hot Escape version puts the map of Arrakis towards the start of the book, whereas the Ace version puts the map of Arrakis towards the end. And I really, really prefer the world map being at the start. It's nice to see a map of the world we're going to be spending our time in, and I can read ahead and then flick back to that first page, rather than the experience I had with this, which was reading through it and imagining all these places and where they exist location-wise relative to each other, and then at the back there was a map, and I was like, oh yeah, I liked that from the beginning. That's enough about the actual physical materials though. Let's talk about the actual stories within these pages and talk about some of the characters and the themes present within. Condensing it as simply as I can, Dune tells the story of a young ducal heir, Paul Atreides, who after moving to the planet of Arrakis with his family, a planet also known as Dune, he narrowly manages to escape the downfall of his house, following a sinister betrayal orchestrated by a rival house, the Harkonnens, in a devious plot involving the Emperor himself, the man who all great houses in the universe must answer to. After Paul and his mother Jessica escape the slaughter, they disappear into the harsh desert environment of Arrakis, where they end up being taken in by the Fremen, natives of the planet. Paul ends up becoming a part of the Fremen people and eventually ends up leading them as a messianic figure. This is possible due to a set of prophetic beliefs that had previously been planted into Fremen culture by a mysterious sisterhood known as the Bene Gesserit over the course of many, many generations, which causes the local people of Arrakis to see Paul as a promised figure of legend. So, with Paul now leading an army of fanatical Fremen warriors, guided by powers of prescience that were granted to him by a combination of Bene Gesserit training, Mentat training, and effects from consuming the spice melange, which is the prized substance Arrakis is known for exclusively producing, the young Duke goes on to avenge his fallen house, taking revenge both on the Harkonnens and on the treacherous Emperor. Paul finally establishes himself not just as the rightful ruler of Arrakis, but as the new base of power within the universe, for he now controls the flow of spice, and he who controls the spice controls the universe. I have skipped a lot of detail there, but that is the story stripped down to its basics. Ultimately, Dune dares us to reflect upon and ask ourselves heavy, existential, philosophical questions, such as, what if a white boy learned enough Arabic? Could he then start his own jihad? The answer may surprise you. In all seriousness, this story and its world building would go on to influence and inspire elements found across later popular sci-fi, such as Star Wars and Warhammer 40,000. And after reading it, it's not hard at all to see how it became so influential. There are so many original and unique concepts within this world that I absolutely adore. There's other elements of the story that I'm not so enthusiastic about as well, but we'll save criticisms and such for later. I'm going to focus a bit on the themes that are present in the story now, but before going into them, I just want to highlight how amazing it is just how many thematic layers are present within Dune. There are so many topics and themes being explored here, from colonization to resource scarcity and how cults of personality form, and you'd think that things might get messy when there's so much overlapping commentary, but instead Frank Herbert manages to touch on many thematic ideas while still keeping his story pretty focused and comprehensive despite how many topics it touches on. It's very easy to tell a straightforward story based around one single idea or theme, but Dune manages to not just center on one thematic idea, but balance focus across multiple without getting lost or muddled or confusing, despite how many ideas it's floating between. I think that's extremely well done. One of my favourite characters in Dune is the Lady Jessica, and I'll explain how she and her sisterhood tie into this idea of ultimate control and rigid analysis, failing in the face of chance and unexpected developments. So Lady Jessica, she is a member of the Bene Gesserit. The Bene Gesserit are a very mysterious, shifty sisterhood who track the heritage and DNA records of all the great houses and try to influence and essentially kind of play matchmaker to try and ensure the ideal combination of genetics. It's eugenics on a galactic scale. They are influencing human evolution as well as operating within galaxy-wide societies as teachers and political advisors while secretly seeking to manipulate and influence political development. They claim that everything they do is to serve humanity, which is technically true from a certain point of view, but that ends up being in a kind of like nanny state sort of way, where they only trust in themselves alone and their own judgment to know what's best for humanity. But by getting involved in politics and manipulating the flow of power within the universe, they're ultimately taking a hold of the ring themselves. They present themselves as humble servants, but truthfully they're vying to be the ones in control in a way that seeks to achieve what is supposedly the best for everyone, but at the price of everybody else's freedom and ability to self-govern. To this end, the Bene Gesserit have schemed for generations to eventually create what they call the Kwisatz Haderach. So, all of the Bene Gesserit are women, and the Reverend Mothers have this ability to look through the genetic memories of all previous female ancestors. The Kwisatz Haderach, however, will be a male, and he'll be able to look into the past through the genetic memories of all previous female ancestors and all previous male ancestors, so he can draw on the collective knowledge and data of the lived experiences of all past ancestors, male and female. Additionally, the Kwisatz Haderach will have the ability of prescience, giving him extremely accurate glimpses into future events yet to pass. The way prescience works in this universe, which I really dig and appreciate, is that it's less of a certain future and more of possibilities. But anyway, the Kwisatz Haderach will have the absolute knowledge of the past, glimpses into the future, and overall will become an extraordinarily powerful being, and if the Bene Gesserit want to have ultimate control of humanity's future, then that is an extremely powerful being to have under their control. A being who essentially sees everything that has happened, is happening, and will happen. So Lady Jessica comes from this sisterhood, and she was paired with the Duke Latham, and as she had been ordered by her sisterhood. She was expected to give Duke Leto a daughter, but Leto wanted a son. And Jessica loved this man. So when Leto at some point expressed a desire to have a son, because the Bene Gesserit have like amazing superhuman control of their body and muscles and organs and their functions, Lady Jessica, to make Leto happy, made it so that their resulting baby would be a boy, choosing Leto's happiness and their love over her sisterhood's orders. As we mentioned earlier, the Kwisatz Haderach has to be a boy, so when Jessica gives birth to a son, the Reverend Mothers of the Bene Gesserit are in uproar. They ordered Jessica to produce a girl. That is what they willed as part of their grand plans. So because Jessica has instead produced a boy, they fear that she's going rogue and trying to produce the Kwisatz Haderach for herself. But the beautiful thing is that Jessica is not the conniving mastermind they fear she is. She isn't some egotistical rogue agent who wants to create and hoard the Kwisatz Haderach and his power for herself. She just produced a boy because her lover Leto wanted one, and she wanted to make him happy. This choice sets so much in motion, and as we look at this theme of absolute control and accurate predictions versus the loss of control and unexpected events, we need to acknowledge how almost everyone throughout Dune is vying for control over many things. The Harkonnens want to control Dune because that planet exclusively produces the most valuable substance in the galaxy, known as spice. Controlling this keeps them rich. The Emperor wants to maintain his control over the galaxy. That's why he gets involved in the plot with the Harkonnens to destroy Paul's house, the House Atreides, because he feared that the Duke Leto was growing powerful enough to become a rogue house and possibly even challenge the throne. Meanwhile, the Bene Gesserit are spending generations upon generations fine-tuning DNA combinations to create their Kwisatz Haderach to achieve a near-omniscient being so they can better control humanity's future. Everyone is trying to establish control over something, and they all have various plans and schemes and contingencies. Another big recurring theme within Dune is the idea of plans within plans. Everything is part of a multi-layered plot for scheming individuals to get what they want. It's one massive multiplayer game of chess happening across multiple boards, across multiple rooms, and amidst all of this scheming and clandestine plotting, the Kwisatz Haderach does get created through Paul, but it wasn't by some delicate calculation or precise manipulation. It was by the random chance that Lady Jessica would be paired of Duke Leto, and that the two would love each other so much, and Jessica would want Leto to be so happy that she would defy her given orders by the Bene Gesserit to give him a son. That choice and that event was completely unexpected by the Bene Gesserit, and it's what finally creates the Kwisatz Haderach. It wasn't a plan spanning centuries, it wasn't the result of a multi-layered conspiracy, it was one person's emotional, irrational, illogical act of love that would finally create this powerful being. I do want to talk about Jessica more later. She's a great character. So coming back into focus of this idea of control and chaos, the predictable and the unpredictable, we see this theme rear its head again with the character of Liet Kynes and his unfortunate death. Liet Kynes is a planetary ecologist. He studies the ecology of Arrakis, and his life has been dedicated to studying the, so to speak, rules of Arrakis' organisms and environment and how every component affects one another. During our story, Liet Kynes gets captured by the Harkonnens and is stripped of all tools, weapons, and survival gear before being left to wander the harsh desert expanse, fated to eventually succumb to exhaustion, if not being devoured by a sandworm or some other dangerous creature of Arrakis before then. During his wandering through the desert, Kynes hallucinates his father and reflects on his teachings as a predecessor, a previous ecologist. The main point that interests me here is Kynes' final thoughts. You see, a pre-spice mass is erupting below Kynes, which will kill him in the ensuing chemical reaction, and before he dies, he thinks this to himself. Then, as his planet killed him, it occurred to Kynes that his father and all the other scientists were wrong, that the most persistent principles of the universe were accident and error. Even the Hawks could appreciate these facts. The most persistent principles of the universe were accident and error. It does not matter how closely we study something or what factors we purposely put in place to try and manipulate or coerce a certain result, there is always the risk of accident and of error, and I would say that the Bene Gesserit made an error when they purged Jessica of Leto, and the very coming of the Kwisatz Haderach was an accident of Jessica's desire to make Leto happy, not a planned event. Two more things I'd like to mention regarding this theme before moving on to another one is Paul's little sister Aaliyah, who describes herself as being a cosmic accident, once again tying back into this theme. And finally, there is the way that Paul is granted the ability of prescience, and I love the way Frank Herbert describes the experience of having this ability. But what's particularly of note is that when Paul has glimpses into the future, all he is seeing is possibilities. The future is in flux, it branches out, it has variations and alternate paths besides just one set path set in stone. There's a great moment where Paul is choosing his Fremen name, and he has received terrifying visions by this point of a galaxy-wide jihad held in his name, where the warriors chant his name, Muad'Dib. So then when choosing his Fremen name, Paul asks if he can basically marry his Atreides heritage and adopted Fremen culture together, and instead be known as Paul Muad'Dib, combining the names. Stilgar, the leader of the Fremen tribe, agrees to this, and Paul notices that he never received any prophetic visions or glimpses of Paul Muad'Dib, and he even briefly wonders if this slight change is enough to stop or at least slow down the future jihad from happening. The fact that Paul's prescience even allows there to be blind spots and uncertainties, the fact that he can be surprised or be confronted with things he never saw ahead of time, allows there to continue to be accidents and errors, and it is ultimately these cosmological spanners in the works, those unexpected and unplanned mistakes, that will have the final say in how things develop. It's as the old saying goes, man plans and God laughs. Another theme present in Dune, and I would argue this is probably what it's most well known for and celebrated for, is the critical breakdown of heroic figures, of charismatic leaders, and the formation of cults of personality. This was an element I really personally enjoyed, because in my own life, I have my idols, right? I think everyone does, but I've never been one for celebrity culture. I've never let myself believe that anybody is flawless, and while I've never considered anyone to be innately inferior, on the flip side, I've never believed anyone to be innately superior either. Going back to celebrity culture, a mindset I started cultivating when I was around 16 or so was reframing the way I thought about musicians and actors and film directors, which was creating this distinction of, I love the work, I don't love them. I don't know them. I'm sure you've had that before if you're talking about an author or a film director and someone goes, oh, I love Guillermo del Toro. Oh, I love Suzanne Collins. Oh, I love Taika Waititi. And this might sound very pretentious, but just for the sake of accuracy, it would be more accurate to say, no, you love del Toro's films. You love Taika Waititi's work. It's a simple distinction just to acknowledge that you know their work but not the creator, but I think that mindset is what's kept me safe from ever forming parasocial relationships with anyone. And I do genuinely think there is a danger to putting people on pedestals or treating them as superhumans, which this story dives into in a way that's both fascinating and entertaining to read. Paul is known throughout fiction as being a great example of this charismatic leader and a bit of an anti-hero, but the breakdown of the hero begins way earlier in the book. The questioning of the hero status starts way before Paul even becomes a messiah-like figure, and it actually begins with his father, Duke Leto. I think most people, especially if they were lucky enough to have a healthy childhood and a healthy upbringing, remember one of the first, not even role models, but superheroes being their own parents. We looked to our fathers and mothers to be our problem solvers, protectors, and advisors. They were bigger than us, stronger younger than us, they knew more than us. The parent is one of our first heroes as a child. And in Dune, we get this passage which really struck a chord with me. There is probably no more terrible instant of enlightenment than the one in which you discover your father is a man with human flesh. From Collected Sayings of Muad'Dib, and as we later learn, Muad'Dib is Paul. This is Paul reflecting on his father Leto. I think this passage strikes a chord because I think everyone has had that moment when they were a kid where their parents suddenly stopped being superheroes. They may still be good role models and loving parents, but there's a moment where your dad needed help with something or didn't know the answer to a question or got something wrong, and you realized, oh, this is just another human. And in so many years, I'll be an adult, and all an adult is just a bigger, wiser kid. They're not perfect or all-knowing or all-powerful. This is one of the first instances of taking that hero figure we intimately know, our own parents, and reminding us of that lesson that hit us somewhere between childhood and teenage years, where we first realized that there was no super beings. So to focus on Leto, we get a moment, I think in the same chapter that opens with that epigraph, or it might be a bit later on, where we've already been told that the people love Duke Leto, and he has this great public image, and the Landsraad all respect him and view him as a noble and a just man. Paul is saying to his dad, don't you know that people love you? We have men who would follow you wherever you would tell them to go. And Leto quite bluntly responds like, yeah, by propaganda corps, they do a good job. Like, right there and then, we're being told that many people view Leto as a honorable man who can command people due to the respect they hold for him, and Leto just hand-waves this devotion as being the product of his propaganda team's work. There's a moment later on as well, where Kynes, Leto, Paul, and Gurney Halleck are in an ornithopter flying over Arrakis, and they see that a sandworm is en route to collide with a spice trawler. They mention that whoever spots an incoming sandworm gets a pay bonus, and Duke Leto is the one to spot it and call the sandworm in. After earning this claim to the pay bonus, Gurney Halleck, a warrior of the House Atreides, calls over the intercom to say that it's the Duke's wish for all the crew aboard the spice trawler to instead receive the pay bonus, and later remarks that Gurney is great at public relations. It creates a sinister undertone that there's good deeds being done, but not necessarily out of benevolence, but to keep this legendary status going amongst the people. However, we do also then see actions that make Leto genuinely benevolent. In the same scene, when the sandworm does attack, Leto announces, "Damn the spice," the precious resource they're harvesting, and he makes every effort to extract every worker from the spice trawler before the sandworm devours it. But even then, you have to question and acknowledge that yes, Leto is being a hero in this situation, and he is saving the workers' lives, but realistically, could he still just be thinking of his public image here? What would that have done to his public image that he's been cultivating on Arrakis if he didn't intervene to help the workers? Could this also be a matter of doing the right thing, not because it's the right thing, but because the other option, to step back and let workers die, would have been harmful to his legacy and reputation? And then there's a moral question. If Duke Leto only does good things because it benefits his reputation and public image, does that somehow undo or invalidate the good he's done, like saving the workers, or when he puts a stop to a tradition where water towels soaked with water are thrown to Arrakeen peasants in a cruel display of water wealth? It reminded me of, there was a time on YouTube, I think it was around 2015-ish, where influencers made content that was solely them going into rough neighborhoods and handing out food, water, even cash to people who are homeless or living rough. And it was all for views, it was all for content, but it raised this moral question. Even if accepting that the content creator is only feeding the homeless to grow their YouTube channel and get views and make money, what difference does that fact make to that starving homeless person who got to eat that day because of their visit and because of their content? If Duke Leto only saved the workers to protect his reputation, what difference does that make to the workers who got to escape death and go home to their families? Can an act be simultaneously good in its resulting effects, but bad in its ulterior intentions. Again, it makes you question not just heroes, but also lets you start identifying propaganda and how it's employed. How many times have you seen politicians get photos taken of them ladling out soup in homeless shelters, but they're not in there every day. They're there that one day for a photo op. Why are we praising them for what is ultimately a spectacle? Earlier, we mentioned the death of Liet Kynes and how he receives hallucinations of his father, the first planetary ecologist on Arrakis who had worked with the Fremen, and something his father identifies and tells his son is, no more terrible disaster can befall your people than for them to fall into the hands of a hero. When Kynes is riding in the ornithopter of Duke Leto and sees the Duke prioritize the lives of the workers over the value of the spice, he thinks to himself, a leader such as that would command fanatic loyalty. Much later in the book, after Duke Leto has died, and as Paul has been operating as a messiah-like figure within Stilgar's Fremen tribe, we see something similar to this. In Fremen culture, leaders are decided by open challenges. The strongest get to rule, with each leader being taken over by a new challenger. Stilgar is aware of Paul's growing power and influence over the group. He knows that many Fremen are really following Paul and not himself, so Stilgar comes to wonder, when exactly is Paul going to challenge him? But Paul has no desire to challenge or kill Stilgar. He recognizes that Stilgar is a competent leader, a strong warrior, and more knowledgeable of Arrakis and the Fremen way of life than himself. So when the time comes, he says that he is valuing Stilgar's life over Fremen tradition. In the same way his father Duke Leto said, forget what happened on this planet before, this is how we're doing things now. Paul also says, forget the traditions that would have me kill you, Stilgar. I want to do things differently in a way that doesn't deny us a warrior as strong as you or a leader as competent as you. I am putting your life first. And as we see, this action ends up with Paul gathering more Fremen followers. The way the Fremen do things gets fundamentally changed. Just as Kynes thought when observing Leto that a leader who puts his lives first will end up commanding fanatical loyalty, as Paul defies the Fremen tradition to challenge and kill Stilgar, we see how much more power flows to him and more Fremen rally around Muad'Dib, he who shortens the way, he who leads the way. This raises its own moral concerns, which again has us questioning, is this actually a hero? We like Stilgar and we can agree that killing him would be counterproductive to Paul's war against the Harkonnen and the Emperor, and it would be a loss for the Fremen. But the leadership challenges were a part of the Fremen tradition, a part of Fremen culture that's existed for centuries, probably longer, and ultimately, Paul may have been adopted by the Fremen, but he is not one of them. He's an outsider who has now came in and changed a fundamental tenet of their way of life. In any other context, a foreign figure coming to the natives and having them change their ways would be viewed as the colonization of those natives. But here, it's being propped up as the Messiah Muad'Dib, changing the way, inviting and leading the Fremen into a new enlightened era. It leaves you with an uneasy feeling. While the Fremen take this event as a sign of changing times, with Muad'Dib showing them the new way ahead, we as the reader are divorced from this fictional religion, and we see it for what it actually is. It is a foreigner who has just came in and completely overwritten a native person's culture. It invites us to question whether Paul is truly a hero and whether the events that are unfolding are actually good in the moral sense. Paul is leading these people into a war, and while the Fremen already had a feud with the Harkonnens, and we can view their war with them as a mutual conflict, to what extent can we say that Paul is essentially harnessing and using the Fremen's animosity towards the Harkonnens for the advancement of his own goals before thinking of what good it will do for them? It comes back to that moral question we had with Leto. Can an act simultaneously be good in its effects, but bad or sinister by its hidden intentions? Paul is leading the Fremen to freedom from the oppression of the Harkonnens, but once that's been achieved, he's also leading them under the rulership of himself. The Fremen will not be self-governed. Paul isn't leading them to retake ownership of their own planet. He is leading them to an endpoint that will see himself ruling Arrakis. He may be a kinder ruler than the Harkonnens were, but he is still an outsider ruling over the natives, and he's taking advantage of the religious ideas planted by the Bene Gesserit to encourage the Fremen to see him and his leadership as a matter that was divinely ordained and not in fact manipulated into being by himself. The Fremen may be willingly following Paul, but that following leaves a bad taste in the mouth when you think about just how much of their fanaticism comes from Paul encouraging their belief that he is a figure of worship promised to them in scriptures that didn't come from a true divine prophet, but instead came from a manufactured belief system engineered and implanted into the Fremen culture by the Bene Gesserit's Missionaria Productiva. Paul is not, in truth, a messiah. He is an opportunist taking advantage of a planted legend he was shaped to match the description of, and his Fremen followers are a legion of hoodwinked fanatics whose faith has been hijacked to serve Paul and his goals. Paul is certainly our protagonist, but he is not necessarily a hero. I'm aware this video is going to be really rambly. I don't want to go on for too long, but just know that there are other themes present as well, such as how environments shape their people. We have characters who categorize humans and make references to some people being just animals. We have resource scarcity and its place in politics and power struggles. But I can already tell this video is going to be a long one, so I'll leave the themes of Dune here for now and move on to the characters. Earlier I mentioned Lady Jessica. She might be my favourite character in Dune. Jessica is one of the Bene Gesserit, and these people alone are such a cool concept. They function like the perfect spies and diplomats because they exercise precise control over their entire body, and it's the same hyper-awareness of their own body and its functions, both involuntary and voluntary, that allows them to maintain a face of complete friendliness while secretly containing thoughts of animosity or betrayal. It's also the same hyper-awareness of their own body that they can project outwards as an extremely well-honed skill of observation on other people's body language, their tone of voice and micro-expressions. Having a conversation with a Bene Gesserit is like being interrogated, but you never even notice the lie detector set in between you, and no torturous instruments that you're aware of are being used. Yet all the information you think you've kept to yourself has already been extracted just from the way you entered the room or sat down, or the specific words you used or tone of voice you spoke them in. They have the power of like ultimate observation. Lady Jessica has all of these abilities, which almost makes her sound inhuman, but despite of all of that, she's arguably the most compassionate character in the book. Any moment where we get her inner thoughts on her son Paul or her husband Leto absolutely melt my heart. And maybe one of the strongest and most upsetting instances of this is when Paul's Mentat training, Bene Gesserit training, and spice consumption all comes together to finally unveil his latent abilities of prescience. And at first, she thinks that she's found some kind of new respect for her son, but that's not quite right. And she realizes that what she's actually feeling isn't respect for Paul, but fear, both of him and for him. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I love Jessica. I think she may be the epitome of what they call a mother's love. Even when she comes to fear Paul and his abilities, her support for him is unwavering. Her love for her husband, Leto, is amazing as well. There's a moment between her and Dr. Yue where they're talking about her relationship with the Duke, and during that conversation she mentions how she is aware of Duke Leto, the public figure, the honourable man, the hero, but she also is aware of Duke Leto, the private man, the man behind the public persona, and she loves him in his entirety. She sees the public facing Duke and the private Duke. She accepts both halves and loves the whole. I wouldn't think to describe or advertise Dune as a romance, but anytime we get to focus on Jessica and her feelings towards Duke Leto, it genuinely makes my heart swell. And all of that compassion is coming from the same character who disarms Stilgar, a Fremen warrior leader, when they first meet in the deserts of Arrakis. I often find that in fiction we get a lot of complex or well-rounded men, whereas the women mostly seem to exist to weep for dead sons or be the number one cheerleader for their partners, or they exist just to be killed and serve as an object of revenge. Lady Jessica is not one of these non-characters. She has a fully developed character that allows her to be as soft or as hard as the situation demands of her. She is as compassionate as she is cold, and she can practice gentleness alongside violence. She is fantastic. To touch on Leto for a moment, I also think he's a fascinating character. From the moment Arrakis, the planet, is given to him, he immediately suspects something is up. And as we get to hear from conversations between himself and Paul, what Leto suspects of the Harkonnens and the Emperor in the future, but what he predicts is going on, and then what happens both immediately and later in the novel, it's amazing just how wise Leto was. I feel like, again, I want to save film discussion more so for the end. I feel like the film version of Leto we get is a much more stripped back version of the book version of Leto. He is a very interesting character, very, very dangerously intelligent. You can see why the Emperor feared him. As the offspring of both Jessica and Leto, we then have Paul himself, Paul Muad'Dib Usal Atreides, the Kwisatz Haderach himself. The best way I can summarize my feelings towards Paul is that I feel that everything that happens to Paul is more interesting than Paul himself. His abilities are more interesting than him. His place within the universe and the terrible purpose he's burdened with is more interesting than he himself. I think an actual problem with the story of Dune is that I don't think Paul struggles enough. Oh, that's a cramp. Oh, that's the universe punishing me. That's the universe telling me to stop this take before fans rip me apart. I know he's a beloved character, I know, and you can have your own opinion, that's fine, but this is mine. I don't think Paul struggles enough, emotionally, mentally, or physically. Like, he goes through a lot, but he just seems to accept everything in its stride and keeps moving forward, but not in a way that feels stoic or like he's exceptionally good at shelving his emotions to deal with them later. He just feels kind of flat or non-responsive at times. When House Atreides is betrayed and their entire house gets destroyed, and his father has been murdered, Paul struggles to cry, and then eventually does. And then that's it. No ruminating on what was lost, no wondering over who may have survived or where potential survivors may have headed to. It's all just very accepting in a way that doesn't feel natural. If your home burned down tonight and you lost everyone but one family member, I understand that everyone grieves differently and different people process strong emotions at different rates and times, but there should still be some kind of a strong reaction that I feel like Paul lacks. I will say an exception to this is in the way he receives visions of a jihad across the galaxy raging in his name, and how he expresses a desire to try and circumvent that bloodshed. We also get a far more interesting Paul when he confronts the Emperor at the end of the book. He takes on an aura of this commanding, authoritative figure as power changes over into his own hands. There's also moments between him and Chani, his love interest, that are extremely tender, and again, while I wouldn't describe or advertise Dune as a romance, there are passages in here that are romantic. I think I like Paul, but the only thing keeping me from loving Paul is that he just doesn't struggle enough. Once his house has fallen and he's living in the desert with the Fremen, everything just kind of seems to go his way with very little complications. One complication that feels like it should be massive is that Paul has a kid with Chani. Like, they have a baby together. And during the conflict towards the end, his baby boy straight up dies. It is murdered, and it's just taken as a matter of fact. Paul doesn't mourn his dead baby, he doesn't break down, we don't see him hold or attend a funeral service, we don't see him turn to his mother to ask does she have any wisdom to give in that case. Paul has a baby, the baby dies, and that's almost treated like a bullet point. There is an argument to be made that Paul's powers of prescience are making him more remote and detached from humanity, as he's experiencing reality and the flow of time in a way we can't comprehend. But then I would have liked to have seen some kind of struggle with that even. That feeling of having your humanity slowly be peeled away from you, and emotions starting to feel more like a grey memory of something you used to have than a thing you still possess. I'd think that would be a terrifying experience and engaging to read, but again, I feel like Paul accepts this with what I can only describe as a sort of passiveness. It could be argued that Paul's ability to see possible futures means that he already foresaw his baby boy's death and had perhaps already accepted it by the time it happened as a necessary step forwards for his conquering of Arrakis. In fact, if I remember correctly, when the signalman is receiving the message that there'd been an attack on Siege Tabur, the siege that contains Paul and Chani's baby, there is a line that says something to the effect that Paul, before receiving confirmation, already knows his son is dead. Now that to me reads as if he already knew because of his abilities. If that's the case, then how long had Paul known through prescience that his son would die? And at what point exactly had he accepted that as a part of things to come? That would have been interesting. I'd have liked to have seen Paul grappling with his prescience, telling him that his final showdown with the Emperor can't happen without his baby dying, and what passage of thoughts and feelings he would have to go down before eventually deeming that as an acceptable loss for the further, greater goal ahead. There are a few times where Paul reflects on the incoming jihad and hesitates over whether or not he can follow through when thinking about the millions dead and bloodshed across planets, but that feels too astronomical to process, to the point that the scale of the bloodshed almost loses meaning. We can't truly comprehend the scale of that loss, but a baby, one baby boy, our son, that we can comprehend. That isn't too abstract, that's intimate. Imagine Paul, right? Imagine in Dune, Paul accepting the carnage to come because the bloodshed is too astronomical to truly process, but then finally having to stop and truly consider the cost once the bloodshed is moved from the macro scale of burning planets to the micro scale of his own dead son. Perhaps it serves the story and the point that Paul is becoming something removed from humanity better, but I would have enjoyed seeing Paul initially find acceptance in the oncoming death of billions, and then immediately having to stop and reconsider once he finds that his own baby boy is going to count amongst the funeral pyres. I think that could have been a great moment of moral crisis, a real dilemma to solve that Paul can't just fight his way out of as a talented warrior, or have it be some Fremen skill that he's immediately good at. It would be a moral test that he'd have to truly sit with and make a heavy decision on. We don't get that though. Instead, his baby dies and the story continues almost as if it hadn't happened. I do wish Paul had struggled more. I would have liked to have seen him overcome more from hard-won battles, not easily won duels, to emotional whirlwinds instead of passive acceptance, and from moral dilemmas instead of a constant certainty that his chosen way forward is definitely the way, and then immediately being proven right. There is a counter-argument to this though, which is that yes, Paul is the ultimate fighter and the ultimate thinker and strategist and a Bene Gesserit mystic and a Mentat trained boy and a messiah. But he kind of has to be perfect at everything because that is what supports his messiah-like appearance to the Fremen. He kind of has to succeed at everything without struggle because it is that which invites the fascination of his prodigy-like capability of all things, which allows the Fremen to see him as a religious idol. I do also think that comes at the cost of him being kind of boring though. But again, the Fremen mythologizing Paul and his feat is just more interesting than Paul himself and his passive acceptance of his ability to seemingly breeze through any problem or obstacle. I think Paul is at his most interesting when he's trying to figure out how to avoid the Galactic Jihad from happening, which ends up happening anyway. And I remember him not feeling all too great about that, but don't recall him lamenting the launching of his jihad as some great failure either. Again, it's just kind of met as, well, you know, this is happening now. I'm Paul Atreides, I'm Paul Muad'Dib, this is happening, I'm okay. I really enjoyed and felt terrible for the character of Dr. Yue. Dr. Yue is a Suk doctor and the personal physician of the Atreides house. I love him, but he is also part of some of the few things I have an issue with within the world of Dune. We will get there momentarily. Dr. Yue had a wife, a Bene Gesserit wife, but she was taken by the Harkonnens. And the Harkonnens promised Dr. Yue that they would release her if Yue would betray the Atreides family for them, and that's how the House of Atreides meets its downfall and how Duke Leto was murdered. Dr. Yue I found to be extremely sympathetic because there's multiple instances where he's reconsidering his actions, but ultimately he is driven by a love for his wife, and in the end he ends up going down this kind of middle of the road approach. He does follow through with betraying the Atreides, but then he also has a sort of double-cross betrayal where he does lower the shields of Arrakeen and does incapacitate Duke Leto, but he also arranges for an escape for Lady Jessica and Paul and hides a poisonous breath weapon in Leto's fake tooth that he can use to ideally kill the Harkonnen Baron Vladimir. I loved that Yue knew what he was doing was wrong, but still followed through with it in his own little sneaky way, laying these traps to try and kill the Baron and ensure House Atreides' survival through Paul and Jessica. But tragically, as the book tells us, Yue is forever remembered and cursed as a traitor, with historians never knowing that he gave the poison tooth to Leto or organized for Paul and Jessica's escape. It's tragic. Also, all this was being done with the promise of reuniting Dr. Yue with his wife, but the Harkonnens had already killed his wife, which he seems to already suspect before it gets confirmed, before they then kill him. It's also bleak for Yue. I also really enjoyed reading his interactions with Lady Jessica, because as we mentioned before, Bene Gesserit is like a human lie detector, and it's only because of Yue's wife being a Bene Gesserit herself that he's familiar with their truth sense and how acute their senses are to deception. So he has to carefully dance around and carefully choose specific words to explain his thoughts and feelings to Jessica without revealing his true thoughts and intentions of betrayal. Speaking of his betrayal though, okay, this does raise one of the only issues I have with Dune, and it's the nature of what a Suk Doctor is, and the Harkonnen scheme to break Yue's Imperial conditioning to make him the perfect traitor. So, for context, we're told that a Suk Doctor receives training and Imperial conditioning which cannot be broken, that ensures a Suk Doctor can never willingly bring harm onto the patients. Because Dune is set in our world's future, I suppose the idea of this conditioning is that it's supposed to be like what the Hippocratic Oath becomes in the future. So one of the big villainous things that the Harkonnens have done is found a way to break Imperial conditioning over the Doctor. Everybody believes that the conditioning is unbreakable, so they would never suspect Yue to be a traitor, but the evil Harkonnens have secretly found a way to do it. At first, the breaking of the conditioning is treated as their secret achievement. The details of how it was achieved are kept in the dark. As the story goes on though, we find out that the brilliant method that the Harkonnens pioneered to break Suk Imperial conditioning is kidnapping and torturing the guy's wife. Now, I don't know if you guys are history buffs, but hostage taking has historically been a tried and true method to force an opponent to comply, because the safety and well-being of their loved ones is in their enemy's hands. So it may just be like the oldest and most ultimate method of threat and coercion. From the pages of Wikipedia, it says, hostage taking predates written human records. Ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece and Rome routinely exchanged royal family members as formal diplomatic hostages. You mean to tell me that hundreds or thousands of years into the future, we create a medical school that boasts having conditioned doctors, and when that conditioning was presumably put to the test, nobody said, hey, why don't we see what the Doctor does if we threaten a loved one? You know, like one of the oldest tricks in the human book of applied pressure and threat. And it also raises another question for me. The Harkonnens and the Atreides, they're famously rivals, and Lady Jessica and Dr. Yue describe each other as being long-time good friends. At some point, Yue's wife got kidnapped by the Harkonnens. Why did Yue never report that? Why didn't anyone in the House Atreides ever say, "Hey Doc, I'm here for my regular checkup. I got a bad bruising from Gurney Halleck in training. By the way, Doc, how's your wife?" "Oh, you know, Paul, she's been kidnapped." Why did that create any consequences for anyone? Also, what about the Bene Gesserit themselves? There's a thing about the sisters of the Bene Gesserit have to protect one another. What were the Bene Gesserit thinking when Dr. Yue's wife got kidnapped and tortured? Did that not concern the Bene Gesserit either? Duke Leto was said to be beloved by the Landsraad. You mean to tell me he couldn't go before them and say, "Hey guys, I know we don't like war. It's expensive on both lives and resources. We should avoid war as best we can, and that's why I'm making an open plea before you all. This is my house's imperial doctor, Yue. I'm sure you all have a doctor too." Well, my doctor has a wife, and his wife has been kidnapped by the Harkonnens. All I want is for House Harkonnen to release my doctor's beloved wife, and if they refuse, surely all of us can collectively agree that this was a crime. I'm not sure if I missed something or if this gets covered in the appendices and I didn't notice, but I really want to understand how Suk conditioning never accounted for the threatening of a loved one, or why Yue was never able to report the fact that he, as the personal doctor to a great house, had his wife kidnapped by another house, who were understood to not be well liked either. They're seen as brutal animals by everyone else, but Yue couldn't report this. And why did nobody else even question or ask about the fact his wife was missing? Yeah, I do love this book, and I love the world it depicts. I love the concepts it introduces, but I don't understand any of that. And in fact, let's move on to criticisms here. I don't actually have a lot to criticize, because I've already touched on how I think Paul could be a bit of a boring character, and how I don't really understand how the kidnapped doctor's wife situation came to be. But otherwise, I do enjoy and would recommend this book. But if I had any other complaints, it would be the sand foam paracompass scene, and the subplot of people suspecting Jessica as being a traitor. I'll start with the former. When Paul and Lady Jessica are traversing the wild desert expanse of Dune, there is a moment where they have this pack of survival gear. The dunes, the sands, they shift, and Jessica and the pack get buried under the sand. Paul manages to get Jessica out from the sand, but the pack is still somewhere below them, and if they try to dig, then the loose sand will just shift and cave in again. So Paul has what's called a paracompass device, which is said to have acidic batteries inside. And Paul remembers that the spice, which can be found sitting across nearby sands, is highly alkaline. Meanwhile, he can draw a measure of water from his stillsuit. So Paul mixes the chemical components to create a green foam, which he then slathers across the sand to firm it and prevent it from immediately cascading back down while he and his mother dig. The end result is that they retrieve the survival pack, and nothing of consequence really happens. None of the gear is ruined from being buried, it's all retrieved intact. The Paris compass gets sacrificed, but they weren't using it anyway, and there's no toss-up between the risk and reward of losing the paracompass's navigational abilities to retrieve the pack. It's also hard to visualize just how large the sand dune is, and just how much foam was produced to be able to create a barrier wide enough to hold back loose sand from falling into a hole being dug. If you straight up ripped out these pages, nothing of significance would be lost. The fact that the spice is alkaline is not important, it never comes up again. The fact that they're now without a paracompass doesn't affect anything. If I can be a bit speculative here, I'd assume there's two reasons why this scene exists. For one, I know that Dune first existed as a serialized story in science fiction magazines, I don't think it's too crazy to imagine that since I found out the paracompass scene does exist, both in this book and in the original iterations of the serialized magazine, this scene may have just been filler to pad out a published serialized story. That's one little theory. For a second thing, I know that Frank Herbert read the works of Isaac Asimov. If anyone's read like old school science fiction or consumed any old science fiction media, you'll know that there is a much larger focus on the scientific element than there is in the science fiction we get today. Today's science fiction likes to place characters against futuristic backdrops with speculative fictional technologies and worlds that kind of exist as a spectacle. Whereas old school sci-fi tends to put a far larger focus on hypothetical ideas and explorations of biology, technology, physics, astronomy, and chemistry. Science is at the forefront of the fiction. Now, I've only ever read Asimov's I, Robot short stories. I own The Prelude to the Foundation, but I've yet to read it. In I, Robot, there's a story where two engineers, for lack of a more accurate term, are trying to diagnose why a robot is not performing its given task as it should, and it starts to go into what the exact directives were that the robot was given, and also explains what chemicals or what elements are present in the environment that are otherwise creating a circumstance that interferes with the machine's given objective. There is a large focus on the logic of the machinery and the chemistry of the environment in a way that makes logic and chemistry the stars of the show, which is typical of old school sci-fi. The focus is on the scientific progress and exploration of real scientific concepts. If Frank Herbert was inspired by such writings, then the whole scene where we reveal that the spice is actually highly alkaline and the paracompass has acidic batteries, then we essentially get a classic baking soda and vinegar chemistry project in the middle of our story. It just kind of feels like Frank Herbert pointing and going, look, my science fiction also has a scientific focus. Just look at this chemistry scene. That may come across as very reductive, harsh, or an insulting take on Frank and his intention with this scene, but I truly don't get the point of its inclusion unless it was to pad out the plot of a serialized magazine story, or if it was an attempt to briefly shine a spotlight on actual chemistry in a way reminiscent of the more science-focused science fiction of the time. Either way, the scene feels pointless to me, and the story is better, in my opinion, without its inclusion. My other criticism is that we have a whole subplot going on, which is that when the Atreides arrive to take over stewardship of Arrakis after the previous ruling house, the Harkonnens, Duke Leto already expects the entire handover of the planet to be a trap of sorts. Everything leading up to the betrayal of Dr. Yue is so suspenseful in an amazingly dreadful way. You know that the betrayal is going to come. It tells you as much. It gives you Yue's perspective. You get epigraphs that tell you he's a traitor. You just don't know when the strike is actually going to be made. It's brilliant, it's suspenseful, it's lovely. During this time though, people within House Atreides, they start investigating and speculating one another as they become certain that there is a mole or a spy or a traitor within their midst, especially after Lady Jessica receives a coded message from Countess Fenring that they're in immediate danger from within. Meanwhile, Uthia Hauer intercepts a false message planted by Harkonnens that implicates Lady Jessica as being the traitor. Duke Leto meanwhile has the idea to act like he suspects and distrusts Jessica to throw his enemies off and make them think he's falling for their induced paranoia, when really in reality he doesn't suspect Jessica at all. The point of all of this is to create distrust within the Atreides household and keep everyone looking to the wrong person, such as Lady Jessica, instead of identifying Dr. Yue. But I take a few issues with this. Firstly, from the Harkonnen perspective, if I've actually planted a traitor in that house, then I don't want to inspire any reason for them to have any kind of internal investigations happening at all. Even if people don't suspect Yue because of his Suk conditioning, and even if my false intel specifically points at Lady Jessica, I think it'd still be unwise to draw the Atreides security forces to look inward at all, knowing that I in fact do have a traitor there among them. By inviting the Atreides to consider that Lady Jessica could be a traitor, I would think that that would then inspire them to consider if Jessica has co-conspirators, and if Lady Jessica and Dr. Yue have described each other as close friends, why not take the precaution of checking Yue out too, even despite his condition? conditioning. What is the harm in being doubly safe, even despite the supposed guarantees of Imperial conditioning when we're trying to secure the safety of our Duke and his heir? I think it was a total misplay to make the Atreides look inwards at all, so long as I do have a traitor planted inside of them. I would want to do everything to keep their attention outward, raiding spice trawlers, intercepting delivery frigates, taking lasgun pot shots at Atreides patrols, everything to make the Duke and his security forces feel certain that the threat is external, and keep all attention away from the internal when I do have my actual threat hidden in there. I know that everyone is supposed to think that Suk conditioning is unbreakable, but why risk having them look inwards at all when you do have an actual traitor planted inside? It creates this needless risk. It puts a pressure on the Doctor, when for all you know, that added pressure could then make him crack and tell the Atreides what's going on. It's better to keep the heat off of him entirely, so Dr. Yue can keep his cool and commit to his betrayal without worrying about a Mentat chief of security or a Bene Gesserit lady security checking everyone they come across. Harkonnen plans aside, Thufir receives false intel to suspect Lady Jessica, and I actually did find their interactions fun to read. It's interesting seeing how his security-focused Mentat training goes head-to-head with Jessica's Bene Gesserit powers of observation. However, in the end, Yue is not suspected, and he does succeed in his betrayal. Thufir gets captured by the Harkonnens and ends up working for them for a time, before the end of the book where he'd rather kill himself than betray Paul. The only person who still suspects Jessica of possibly being a traitor is Gurney Halleck, and this also ultimately leads nowhere. When Gurney and Paulie reunite, Gurney privately thinks to himself, oh my gosh, this poor lad, he doesn't even know about his mother's betrayal, I'll kill her. When Gurney and Jessica meet again, he calls her a traitor. Jessica says she isn't. Gurney repeats that she is. Then Paul explains that they have a confession from Yue regarding his betrayal, confirming that it wasn't Jessica, and then Gurney just apologizes and drops it. I think the whole intelligence war on House Atreides was fun at the time of reading it, but I still think it's a silly move on the Harkonnens' behalf, and then having Gurney Halleck aware of Thufir's suspicions ultimately leads to a one-page long moment of tension that has him call Jessica a traitor. Paul refutes and gives evidence to the contrary, and then Gurney apologizes. And that is that. We're now going to move on to a comparison of the films Dune Part 1 and Part 2. I think Parts 1 and 2 are great film adaptations of this story, and for people who have seen those films, you may have already noticed that the two things I had gripes with in this book, the Paracompass scene and Thufir and Gurney suspecting Lady Jessica, are both entirely missing from these films. I think the films do a great job at telling this entire story in a way that's ultimately more efficient. That comes with the territory of being films. With a book, you pick it up and accept it's going to be a time commitment. It could take you hours, days, weeks, or months to finish it, but you read it when you choose, which gives the book some freedom to meander or become tangential. A film has an hour and a half to 2 hours. It does not get that same freedom the book has, and has to be way more precise and condensed in its storytelling. The fact that the Paracompass moment and the Traitor Jessica subplot are missing from the films, and both films still excellently tell largely the same story, to me, proves how significant the original scenes of the book were to the plot. There are other differences between this book and the two films I want to touch on. For one, I mentioned earlier the death of Liet Kynes, and how the book gives us his dying thoughts that seem to reinforce this theme of unexpected random events flying in the face of controlled predictions, but that is missing in the film, which I think is a shame. However, while those thoughts from the ecologist are missing, I do prefer the death they gave Kynes in the film. Summoning a sandworm to consume her and her killers is badass, and still has Kynes fall victim to the planet's food chain in a way that's different from the book, but more visually spectacular. There's also a character known as Duncan Idaho. Duncan seems to have way more significance in the films than he does in the book, but now that I'm partway through Dune Messiah, I think I can see why now. But I'll hold on to those thoughts for after I've finished Messiah, and this will be a very fun topic to return to after part 3, I am sure. But in the meantime, just know that it's weird how much of a focus the film puts on Duncan Idaho compared to how little of a focus the book puts on Duncan. We touched a bit on Duke Leto earlier, and yeah, I feel like his character character was stripped back a lot in the film. Oscar Isaac does manage to play the part of a loving father and a charismatic leader extremely well, but like I mentioned earlier, the book manages to explore ideas of heroes and cultural personality, firstly with Leto, way before it engages in such ideas with Paul. And I feel like that was missing in the film. But again, I also understand that Dune Part 1 is working off a runtime, and some things have to be cut. Still, I wish we could have seen a bit more of Leto's cunning and strategic thinking that was present in the book. I will say, after reading the book and watching the film again, I can now tell in the film that Leto knows something is up, and that he can foresee the downfall of his house. The scene where he tells Lady Jessica that he should have married her was very sweet the first time I watched it, but then after reading the book and then watching that scene again, it's obvious now that that isn't just a confession of love, but him voicing a regret, as he can see the time to have done that has passed, and that his time with Jessica is coming to its end. Concessions have to be made, and I don't mind the betrayal of Duke Leto that we got. I just wish we'd got to spend just a few more scenes with him and got to enjoy more of the moral complexity we get in the book. But again, what we got in the film is not bad. This next one is a bit of a nitpick. I found it weird how often the book describes Gurney Halleck as an ugly lump. And in the film, they go ahead and cast Josh Brolin. That man is far from ugly, but less of a nitpick and more to do with this character. There was a change between the film and book that I really loved, which was that in the film and the book, Gurney has a personal vendetta against the Harkonnen known as Raban, the Beast. In the book, Raban is found dead after the final climactic battles, and as such, Gurney is denied his chance for vengeance for his family. When Thade Ralpher appears with the Emperor, Gurney asks Paul if he can duel and kill him, accepting Thade as a sort of substitute for Raban, but Paul denies this to Gurney, which is essentially him denying him his vengeance in a way that feels kind of cruel to Gurney. However, in the films, we see that in the ensuing battles between Fremen, Harkonnens, and Sardaukar, Gurney Halleck does find and kill Raban. If Raban was due to die in battle either way, then I like that the films actually give Gurney his revenge, especially after that character had been so loyal to the Atreides and loyal to Paul. It almost felt like a karmic reward for him to get that revenge. Another difference between the two is the matter of Paul's son. I mentioned this when discussing Buck Paul as a character. He and Cheney have a baby boy named Leto, which is obviously very sweet. When Siege Tabur is attacked, the baby is killed by Sardaukar, and Paul's sister, that's another difference we'll come back to, gets captured. I already mentioned how weird it is that the book treats the murder of Paul's baby son like a footnote. Well, Dune Part 2 just omits baby Leto completely. Instead, Cheney and Paul never had a child, and no child is murdered, or at least no child of Paul's is murdered during the attack on the Siege. The attack happens, specifically led by Thade Ralpher, which is less of a change and more of an added detail that I like. But there is no baby murder. I already mentioned that it's so weird how little an effect the birth and murder of baby Leto has on Paul in the story, so I'm ultimately not surprised that they just removed it entirely from the films. I mentioned then that Paul has a sister at Siege Tabur, so that's actually a few things to get into here with Paul and his family. In the films, Lady Jessica is carrying the baby Aaliyah, and after consuming the water of life, we can see that this baby, still within the womb, seems to have developed a consciousness and a sort of external awareness that is equal parts creepy and cool. But in the book, Paul's sister Aaliyah has already been born. She is 2 years old by the end of the final confrontation, but due to Lady Jessica drinking the water of life, Aaliyah has the shared memories of all previous Reverend mothers in her head, causing her to essentially have developed a mature mind stuck within a still developing infant body. Again, it's very creepy and cool. You have a baby, but within her head is all the genetic memories of those mothers who came before, so her brain just ends up advancing way ahead of the rest of her. This means you have a 2-year-old walking around speaking with the maturity of a child, but containing the knowledge of an adult. And during Paul's attack, she runs around and like slits throats, which is insane. Like, imagine the galactic jihad begins and your death as a soldier is getting killed by the psychic 2-year-old. There's just insane shit in this book. I love it. I said then about there being a few things to get into about Paul and his family. Missing from the films entirely is that after the death of Jamis, there is a ceremony. Or Jamis, sorry, where members of the tribe declared himself as a friend of Jamis before taking a possession from him. I loved this moment. I actually hate that it's missing from the film. The whole, Usul gives water to the dead, and the constant mythologizing of everything Paul does, even crying, is great. However, because Paul killed Jamis, this means he also takes on Jamis's wife and his children. That development is completely missing from the films. We never meet Jamis's wife or his children, and I don't really mind this, since the book rarely mentions his wife again, and I don't think ever mentions Jamis's children again, at least not that I can remember. However, even if the film wanted to omit Jamis's wife and children, I still wish they had kept the "I was a friend of Jamis" ceremony. The films also remove Thufir being captured and working with the Harkonnens. Instead, it seems to imply that Thufir was killed during the Harkonnen attack, and I don't have much issue with that. There is the character of Count Fenring, who is missing from the film. To summarize him, Count Fenring was essentially intended to be an attempt at the Kwisatz Haderach, but he never became it. The book mentions that Fenring is a genetic eunuch, which I can't tell if that means the Bene Gesserit influenced his genetics for him to be without genitalia, or if that means he's infertile, but either way, he is depicted as an extremely powerful man who refuses to kill Paul even on the Emperor's orders. I suppose that Fenring sees in Paul who or what he could have been. Meanwhile, Paul, who is caught up in the accumulation of plans centuries in the making that existed way before him, gets to meet someone from a prior generation, the last failed attempt at a Kwisatz Haderach before he himself came along. There's something special there between them, between what could have been and what wasn't, and I think that Fenring is a very interesting character. But ultimately the films don't suffer from him not being there. I like him, I would have liked him in the films, but I do not mind that he's absent from them. Finally, one of the biggest differences I want to address is Chani herself, Paul's love interest. In the book, Chani is just a straight up ride or die. She is another follower of Paul, and Paul does not seem to mind this. In one of Paul's more interesting character moments, he reflects on whether he had just lost a friend and gained a follower, with these thoughts relating to Stilgar. Have I lost a friend and gained a follower? It acknowledges that within that dynamic of the worshipped and the worshipper, you're not equals, and we know that our friends are people that we have deemed to be our peers. Paul has no such thoughts towards Chani though. He loves her and she loves him. She also sees him as a messiah figure. Movie Chani, however, who is my preference between the two, is far more interesting because she is a skeptic. She is a Fremen, she is familiar with their ways and their culture and religious beliefs, but she does not believe that Paul is the voice from the outer world. One of my favourite things in the Dune films was this critical look at how a messiah figure or any idol becomes dehumanized. They become a figure held up on a pedestal and are no longer allowed to be a fellow person on equal footing. In the films, as fanatics grow around Paul, Chani still sees him as this skinny boy from Caladan she met in the desert, who she had to teach proper sand walking. She loves him as a fellow human being. When Paul's powers over the Fremen grow, she seems scared and disapproving of this, and I love that. Book Chani is along for the ride as another follower. Film Chani is pumping the brakes and saying, hold on, what is happening? Why are we all bowing to this boy? For me, my ideal depiction of Paul and Chani would be all the romantic passages from the book, but keep Chani's skepticism from the movie. It means a lot more if she disregards the Messiah stuff because she loves Paul for Paul, than to love Paul but also worship him, because then it feels uncertain if she's more in love with him or just in awe of him as a religious icon. All in all, Dune Part 1 and 2 are great adaptations of this book. They are very efficient in what they choose to omit and change. And as far as the original book is concerned, I think it isn't perfect, but it is great, and it is no wonder that it's one of the most popular and best-selling works of fiction of all time. I enjoyed it. I'm so far also enjoying Dune Messiah, and I can't wait for Dune Part 3 this December. I'll say this much for speculation going ahead. Here's my speculation for the books. My only prediction, and again, if you're going to talk spoilers in the comments, please just put a spoiler tag, but one of the first epigraphs says that Dune will forever be Paul's home, and that leads me to believe that at some point in some book, in some film, whatever, Paul will die on Arrakis. As for speculation for the movie, Dune Part 3, I'm really curious where it's going to go, because I just went over some of the differences then, right, between book and film, and if we look at how Dune Part 2 ends, in the film, Aaliyah isn't born yet and has no presence during the attack on Siege the Bear. She didn't lose a baby brother, and she definitely didn't run around slitting throats. She's still in Jessica's womb. Chani and Paul never had or lost their baby Leto together. Perhaps most importantly, at the end of Dune, Paul takes the Princess Irulan to be his wife due to the political power this grants him, but they acknowledge themselves that she's only a wife in title. She's essentially a concubine, and Paul belongs to Chani. Chani is right there at the end overseeing this and seems to be on board. In the same way that Paul claims Jaime is his wife but doesn't love her, Chani seems to see Paul take the Princess Irulan and understand that this is all a matter of appearances and titles and politics. It is only their love that's real. It's only their love that matters. In the movie, however, in a scene that is expertly performed by Zendaya, she watches Paul take Princess Irulan's hand, and she's distraught. She is betrayed. It's a really heartbreaking scene to watch, and one of the final shots of the movie is Chani with the hooks for the sandworms, preparing to ride a sandworm someplace else. She appears to be abandoning Paul, and as I said earlier, she was already disapproving of the religious fanaticism that he's purposefully encouraging and cultivating, so who knows what that means for them. From what I've read of Dune Messiah so far, Chani is right there beside him from the start, so will there be like a time skip in Dune Part 3 where Chani has taken some time alone to consider what Paul's marriage to Irulan really means and then comes back? Or are the films about to diverge and go completely off in their own direction? I have no idea. I'm interested to see what exactly they're going to do going forward cinematically, but in the meantime, I need to get through 5 more books before December. Dune is down. Thanks again, Liz, for getting me into this universe and lending me your own book. I had a lot of fun reading this. I have way more positive things to say than bad. I think that anyone who enjoys sci-fi and wants to get lost in a unique world will enjoy Dune. I'm going to return to reading Dune Messiah. Hopefully I'll enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed this book. So please subscribe and stay notified so you don't miss when I upload my next video talking about it. And take care in the meantime. I'll see you all around. Bye 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 bye.